So thanks for joining us this morning. We're excited to be with you all to talk about some of the opportunities we have with the American Rescue Plan and the ways in which we can use it for our communities into the future. And as I was thinking about the webinar this morning, I was thinking about how it's important for many municipalities are in the business of studying right now how they can be using the ARPA funds, but from a public-private partnership perspective, it's important for both sides of those, the public and the private side, to be familiar with the content of what's available to us through ARPA. My name is Frances Kern-Manone, newly with Frost Brown Todd as the managing director of the Project Finance Advisory Group. And we've formed a collective, nascent collective with the COLAR Experience Institute and Red Tiger as Right to Win Cities. So Right to Win Cities is a nascent, like I said, burgeoning collective of consultants that are designed to help communities in a new way across the broad spectrum of what communities need around public-private partnerships. So we bring to it the data collective that is KEI's new data measurement and impact group through COLAR Design, strategies through Red Tiger with economic development, and then funding mechanisms through the Project Finance Advisory Group of Frost Brown Todd. For now, we're very excited about the future of how public-private partnerships can be recast for the way in which we're going to recover from the pandemic, and would like to flip to the next slide and talk a little bit about where Right to Win Cities came from. So as we talk about how community development work has been done in the past, whenever we do have major disasters, such as a pandemic or flooding or potentially civil discord happening in the streets, it does leave a mark on your community. And and rightfully so in many cases, and what we would like to do is recast the way in which we approach community development work into the future, so that it's not as fragile as it is or has been once the communities are stood back up again. So with me today, I'm excited to bring together some of the resources from Frost Brown Todd, and I'll turn it over to each of the panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Elliott. I'm a senior associate here at Frost Brown Todd. I've been with the firm since 2016. Prior to that, I went to the University of Cincinnati College of Law. For the past 5 years, I focused on public and project finance, and in that capacity, I've served both public and private entities on a number of projects. And lately, during the coronavirus crisis, I've been assisting local governments and public entities with guidance on both the 2020 Coronavirus Relief Fund and the American Rescue Plan Act's state and local fiscal recovery funds, which are similar in some respects, but in other ways very different. So assisting those entities with sort of navigating the similarities and differences.
Thank you, Frances. My name is Amy Condaras, and I am a corporate and public finance attorney here at FBT. My practice focuses on what I call kind of creative economic development. So I do tax-exempt bond issuances for nonprofits, as well as municipalities and other governmental entities. I also do tax credit work, both historic and new market tax credits, and some affordable housing, basically coming up with creative ways to get projects completed. And that also includes public-private partnerships involving a number of those entities.
Hello, I'm Emmett Kelly. I'm also another project finance and economic development attorney here at Frost Brown Todd. I focus on traditional and economic development incentives and working together to provide those same solutions that Amy and Michael talked about. And we're really looking forward to discuss how ARPA can help.
Okay, well, I will kick us off, ARPA 101. So as Frances has mentioned, one of the things when you have natural disasters or worldwide pandemics, they highlight areas of distinct need. And one of the things that came about as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic is the extreme disparity we are seeing with respect to housing, with respect to education, with respect to infrastructure. And one of the primary roles of ARPA is to address that. Generally, the ARPA is intended, these funds are to support public health costs, address the negative economic impact, replace lost public sector funding, frankly, provide premium pay for essential workers, and increase investment in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The way that the Act works is it actually has $350 billion designated across governmental entities. Some of the technical structure are that $195 billion has been allocated to states and DC, and how that's going to be allocated is $25 billion is allocated equally, and then the remaining of that 195 will be based on the average unemployment per state compared to the national average. From there, we have $65 billion that is going to be allocated to the counties. The county allocation is actually based on population, and they're using census data from 2019 for that. The next tier, so to speak, is for metropolitan cities, and that's $45.5 billion. And they're using the definition of metropolitan area and cities under the Housing and Community Development Act. Broadly speaking, what that means is if it's a central city in a metropolitan area established by the OMB, or if it is a city with more than 50,000 people. Tribal governments will get 20 million, and then the remaining amount will be allocated to what we call non-eligible governmental units, which is basically cities under 50, cities, territories, counties, or not counties, but municipalities under 50,000. The allocation at the city level is based on a weighted average of a variety of variables: extent of poverty, it's based on population, housing overcrowded, age of housing, and population growth lag. So there are a number of factors at play, and it's very similar, frankly, to the Community Development Block Grant Program under HUD. So we're using some existing guidances. How the funds can be used and who are the recipients and subrecipients of those funds does vary between states, cities, and counties. We've amended, the government's amended the Social Security Act to provide for guidance for states, territories, and tribal governments under 602, and then cities, counties, and non-entitled units is covered under 603. But they're pretty broad strokes in terms of how it's defined and how those monies can be used. Sub-recipients include public benefit corporations, providing transportation. They include nonprofit corporations, and they also give a lot of guidance or flexibility to the states to provide more restrictions on how they allocate those funds from the state level down. I think that, yeah, and then Emmett, I'll turn it over to you.
I mean, every time I hear those statistics, it just gets bigger and bigger. Honestly, this is a finite opportunity for communities in their recovery. And I think there's a distinct recognition on both sides, public and private, to make sure we get it right. And we build back in a way that is going to be useful into the future. So I'm going to turn this over to Michael, who has been very well-versed in the what's been coming forward from the Treasury Department on the reading it from a private perspective as well as on the municipal side.
Yeah, so as far as what resources are provided, there's several key documents. Obviously, there's ARPA itself, the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund legislation, which provides some basic guidelines as to what funding can be used for and who's receiving funding. In addition to that, the Treasury Department has released a couple of documents. The biggest one is the Treasury Department's interim final rule, which is being referred to as the Treasury's guidance, which provides the most detailed summary of what the funds can be used for and expands on sort of the initial bullet points outlined in the legislation. The FAQ, which is the document that's been most recently updated as of July 19th, provides a number of additional uses and guidance on uses that expand, in my opinion, beyond what the final rule guidance suggests is admissible as proper uses. And then finally, for reporting and guidance, that there's a Treasury reporting and guidance manual that's been provided back in June that outlines what the finer points of reporting from state, cities, and other localities, what the guidelines are and the rules for reporting back to the Treasury on what the funds have been used for and what the economic impact has been.
You know, one thing, Michael, I think is interesting and it's important to note is the FAQ is incredibly user-friendly. They ask all the questions everyone's thinking, and it's in a very palatable format for understanding how the funds can be used. And frankly, as you indicated, the related reporting guidelines, both at the recipient level and the sub-recipient level.
Yeah, and I think the FAQ is sort of really indicated the Treasury is trying to provide additional uses to sort of help state and local governments use fundings in a way that benefits their community the most. The legislation has some limitations that the FAQ sort of gets around by outlining what reporting requirements are necessary to allow for economic development in impacted communities, for example.
So Emmett, I'm going to ask you to speak to this one. And this has been a circulating question around the politics about ARPA. As we know, it was a very one-sided vote when the legislation was originally passed. And now we've got questions on, you know, how there are factions that are trying to use the ARPA funding specifically for infrastructure, but don't mean to ask you a political question necessarily, but there is questions then on the user end as to how we're going to be able to utilize one versus the other.
That's a really good question, and thanks for lobbing in the political question too, Francis. Certainly, you know, maybe taking a little step back before we approach that, you know, looking at some of the things that, you know, ARPA and the CARES Act and the differences there might be a little bit of a help. You know, unlike the CARES Act, which is very detailed, has U.S. Treasury rules governing the permitted spending, the regulations permit somewhat broader scope of spending than the CARES Act. These funds, you know, they can't be spent on pension obligations or cover reduction in taxes, but will be more flexible, as we've talked about, with respect to infrastructure. With respect to what happens with the, you know, we say bipartisan infrastructure bill, you know, it really remains to be seen, but the framework will include roads and bridges, electric vehicle charging stations, electric school buses, city buses, high-speed internet, and we've got some similarity there. The framework provides that some or all these goals will be accomplished by P3s, private activity bonds, and direct pay bonds. So might see some differences there as well. Yeah. And also for a framework for a federal infrastructure financing authority, you know, which is a little different than, you know, you took at look at the one, you know, there's 6 command centers right now, and Dayton here in Ohio is the smallest city that's one of those 6 command centers. So some differences there as well.
So here's an unscripted question for you all. So there's nothing that question open to the panel and open-ended. There is nothing that would preclude how far into infrastructure spending could a community take their ARPA funding. We know the infrastructure bill hasn't passed. It's still getting debated in Washington. But what is before us is a passed legislation with ARPA. Is it possible? How far could you go using ARPA funding if you chose to do so in infrastructure versus other ways? It might be a question for Elliott.
Yeah, so there's a couple of limitations. And the important thing to remember is ARPA allows for some infrastructure, but it's not an infrastructure bill. It doesn't replace the need for a broad-based infrastructure bill, which I think our country sorely needs. There are some things that I think are hints at what would be in a future infrastructure bill that would be more complete. And those are some of the things that are allowed in ARPA. Infrastructure that supports water, sewer, or storm infrastructure, as well as increased broadband, are all allowed under ARPA. There's a general limitation beyond that. However, there is an allowance for in general infrastructure uses to the extent that that money comes from the revenue deficit that's allowed under ARPA. So under ARPA, you are allowed to use an amount up to the revenue deficit, and there's a Treasury formula that's been provided in the Treasury guidance that allows you to calculate your revenue deficit from the previous year, that can be used for general government services, and infrastructure is included in that. But other than water, sewer, storm, and broadband, and the general infrastructure up to that revenue limit, you're not allowed to use ARPA funds for general infrastructure.
And I would just tack onto that and say, ARPA is really intended to address disparities highlighted by the pandemic. Clean water was certainly one of them. Lack of connectivity, for students trying to attend school remotely. Those are two examples of huge needs that were very much different across communities. And so while there's an infrastructure component to ARPA, it's really more intended to address specific issues that were were highlighted or exacerbated by the pandemic.
Yeah, and Francis, and not to go back to the political question, but one of the things that we're seeing across the country is whether federal dollars will be used with state dollars as well, or how those state dollars may be used together. And some states have not grabbed on to those federal dollars yet with their local programs. So we'll see how that goes as well.
Yeah, it's the definition around infrastructure that gets, highly debated as to what infrastructure means. One person's infrastructure is another person's community service agency or entity. So I think it would be useful as a whole. And I think that's what's happening right now in Washington is what we're debating is what is infrastructure. But in terms of how it, go ahead.
No, please finish now.
In terms of how it plays in with ARPA, I was just probing at, inside ARPA, we really cannot be building bridges. And I understand that there's a, there might be some intent around the country to try and do that. And there are restrictions on how far you can take the definition of infrastructure as defined in the ARPA guidelines at the moment.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, hopefully we'll see the infrastructure bill, carry on with the what we did with the Recovery Act back in the Great Recession. And I think, Amy said it well, certainly there's limitations with respect to ARPA and what has been impacted by the pandemic, and really looking for the infrastructure bill to be much broader and to provide, certainly more freedom and definitely encourage a lot of P3 activity as well.
Michael, I was hoping you could address this one for us. Using ARPA funding, economic development and infrastructure, what are the limits on eligibility? And so we're tackling that from a infrastructure side just now, but that is the question everyone's probing at is really whether you're a municipality and you're the ones holding the ARPA funding on the public side, or if you're on the private side and hoping to see it put to use in one way, shape, or form. Let's discuss eligibility.
Sure. And this is one thing that's sort of confused a lot of communities and local governments that we talk to about this is if you look at ARPA and the Treasury guidance with only a cursory view and you sort of get the broad strokes, you'll see that it says that economic development, general economic development, can't be used from ARPA funding. And the same thing with general infrastructure outside of water, sewer, and broadband. But the more deep dive you give into the guidance, you'll see that, for infrastructure, to the extent that it's using funds based on a reduction in revenue from the previous year due to the pandemic, you can fund general infrastructure projects, including maintenance as well as new infrastructure projects as government services. Economic development, as the Treasury guidance says, economic development is not an eligible use. But if you really look into it, you'll see that there are a lot of programs that fall under economic development that it explicitly says are allowed under certain circumstances. And we'll talk about those circumstances in another slide, but some of the things that I see in the Treasury guidance that people aren't aware is usable. You can use ARPA funds for our affordable housing, business grant and loan programs, direct economic aid to impacted industries, and that includes tourism, hospitality, and travel, but any industry that can be directly linked to an economic impact due to coronavirus. And for those of us who were, alive last year, I can't really think of an impacted industry or an industry that wasn't impacted by the coronavirus economic incident. In addition, job training and back to work incentives. And if you look at the most recent FAQ, one of the things they updated is startup business training and assistance falls under job training and back to work incentives. So you can provide funding for startup business assistance for businesses that didn't even exist prior to the pandemic. You can provide funding for parks and outdoor spaces, and as well as, like I said, maintenance and building of new infrastructure. And how that gets in when the Treasury has said that the general economic development isn't allowed is really relies on your ability to link those funding uses to the economic distress caused by coronavirus. Now, on its face, that might be a business that was harmed by coronavirus. You have a restaurant that had to fire its workers and is now struggling to hire new workers. Assistance for job training and hiring incentives are allowed under that. But even new businesses that didn't exist under coronavirus can be linked if the community can provide proof that that business is in a community that struggled during the coronavirus economically, or serves a population or hires a population that struggled during the pandemic. And that's all outlined in the Treasury's FAQ. And that's one of the new things that sort of struck me as a great expansion from what the Treasury guidance initially stated.
And this lost revenue concept in the public sector is different than what we had under the CARES Act. And it's going to provide unique flexibility, because putting those funds back into the municipalities and the governmental entities will allow them to then have it trickle down to the folks in their communities that suffered as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's the language of the negative impacts of the pandemic is this sort of, that becomes, and I was just thinking economic development, it could be same ubiquitous word like infrastructure. Economic development is the same. So one person's economic development is another person's social service, say. But the negative impacts of COVID, of the pandemic, one of the things, and we're going to touch on this again in a later slide, is being able to, here it is, demonstrate how you measure what those impacts are so that you can irrefutably claim from a third party, say, look, this industry really was, or this population group really is in this impacts of COVID. And so, Michael, you want to talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so this is crucial. As we've sort of explained, on its face, the regulations and the ARPA rules seem to suggest that certain programs can't be eligible for ARPA funding. But if you are able to show that there was an economic impact, you can use it for some of those, for some projects that would traditionally fall under economic development or infrastructure. So really what is required is documenting and measuring the impacts in those industries or in the governments or in the communities that the ARPA funding would be applied to, and show that this ARPA funding will provide an impact that will benefit that community and help get it out of the economic sort of impacts of coronavirus. So a lot of larger communities may have the resources to document those impacts and comply with the ongoing reporting requirements. And there are ongoing reporting requirements going out to 5 years after the final expenditure of all funds. Some communities have the resources to do that. And those communities will be benefited by being able to use ARPA funding for greatly expanded uses. And for those communities that don't necessarily have the resources to use the funding for those purposes, ARPA also allows third-party organizations to assist communities that don't have those resources to help them with documenting and reporting both the impacts initially of COVID to their local economies, as well as the effects of the application of ARPA funds on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, so this component, this piece of the ARPA legislation is really important, honestly, because while it might seem apparent about the impact, I think there's a lot of fearfulness around eligible uses. And so one way to eliminate the risk, if you will, whether you're on the public side or the private side, about the use of ARPA in any particular manner is to demonstrate with data specifically how your use, suggested eligible use, would be has been impacted. We do have a question, Michael, that has come through on the chat, and I want to throw it up for a ARPA funds could be used for public inside the Treasury. This is an unscripted question for you guys, but and I put it to Michael, but anybody can answer. It did say that in the guidance that funds could be used for public plazas or parks. If the public plaza is part of a larger redevelopment project, say a P3, could ARPA funds be used to pay for land acquisition and or construction of a public plaza as a public centerpiece to a larger redevelopment project? This gets to the heart of what public-private partnerships is oftentimes what the city or the community can do in order to enhance a private development and vice versa. So I'll leave that open to anyone to answer.
Yeah, so one thing that's interesting about the FAQ is it does suggest that you can combine authorized uses. So in addition to being able to use ARPA funds for a public park, you're also allowed to provide it for impacted industries. If your public plaza or public park is a commerce center or is used for large public gatherings, if it is part of your community's tourism industry to have this public gathering for festivals or other things, you can use it as a tourism expense. If small businesses use it as part of their outdoor eating areas or outdoor gathering spaces, you can also use ARPA funds for that. So really it's about combining. If you can combine different authorizations, you can sort of strengthen your case that these ARPA funds are eligible. So as far as using ARPA funds to pay for a larger redevelopment project, I'd say yes. And then you always want to bolster your case by suggesting this has multiple authorized uses under ARPA.
Yeah, I think that's critical, Michael, like you explained earlier, and I think Francis mentioned as well, certainly providing the data, but I think the answer is absolutely. And this is something that we've seen in the public finance area, doing any type of project, having multiple sources of revenue has really become commonplace over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think a lot of folks throughout the country are really looking to integrate ARPA into those already existing projects or projects that weren't getting off the ground before. And, this helps provide another layer that might, really help spur that larger economic development. So I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, and I would always say, that it's document. Talk about the negative impact. We've talked about, Michael's talked a lot about the measurement component, but the reporting requirements will be the key in terms of making sure that you validate and justify how this component, part of an overall project, was directly impacted by COVID, and how that negative impact is being addressed using ARPA funds.
Yeah, before we move off this, I just want to add, I think, as we're thinking about futures of cities and or communities and how they're innovating, we certainly do not want to be moving forward without having open green spaces nearby. So the next time we run into a medical emergency, such as what we've just been through, we don't have the ability to be able to spread out. So I think there's a case to be made about making sure that as you're doing new redevelopment work, you're doing so in a way that is smart for the future uses of the population. But
Yeah, and Francis, maybe this is a little out of order, so kick me under the table to stop. One of the things that we were going to talk about, and this question really, I think, hits home on that. Denver is really looking at, they're using their 300 plus million, and they've reached out. They're going to reach out to their voters for a $400 million bond package. So I really think that type of program, I think it's called Rise Denver, really looks to utilize and do just that on even a larger scale.
that's timely. We did move to creative uses. So you've already previewed a good creative use. But I see the Denver benefit, or what they've contemplated doing out there, is basically doubling down on and ensuring that we know that this ARPA funding is finite. Hopefully we aren't, or who knows what we're going to wind up doing in the future, but this is not a normal set of a current situation wherein we've got so much funding flowing to our communities. And what they're doing out in Denver essentially extenuates that a little bit longer, so they can benefit from the use, this one-time investment in their community for years to come. There is some trickiness to that, I understand, and Michael might be able to speak to more about the eligibility around that. But anything else that you've seen as creative suggested uses? We do know that the cities have, or communities do have, a timeline that is a horizon much longer than what was afforded in the CARES legislation. So people are still formulating their reactions and their plans for how they're hoping to spend the funds. But what have we seen so far early now that would be a dubbed creative use or suggestion?
Yeah, I'll speak to that quickly, and I know Michael is going to get to some time, because certainly that's a difference than the CARES Act. There's some longer timelines for spending, which is good. It provides more planning, and I think you hit on it right there, Francis. Folks are looking to plan. Rise Denver, certainly they're looking to incorporate, like everyone else, bring back and enhance jobs, strengthen small business and nonprofit, and create growth and resiliency. And they're looking to, this is how Dayton's program is as well. They're looking to certainly strengthen and revitalize neighborhoods and make it easier to do business within the community. And, a lot of focus is on small business, certainly minority-owned business as well. We see that in Franklin County. But the one thing that I've really noticed that a lot of communities are doing, and I see this as a really positive thing, is they're reaching out to the communities, and they're holding public hearings, and they're asking for ideas, and not just, this is not, at least what I've seen locally, not just to the, you would think the, typical suspects. This is a broad outreach to nonprofits, small business associations, et cetera, to ask and genuinely ask, I really think, for ideas on how to use these dollars. And so a lot of that has happened through into July. I think it was last week, Franklin County, or maybe it was the week before, Franklin County had the public hearing, and really had a lot of good input from a real good strata of business community, the nonprofit and for-profit. So and so that's all being formulated now. So it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of that. But we've seen everything from, healthcare to, utility requests from, Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission is very involved in that here in Central Ohio as well. So really going to be interesting to see what comes out of that. And I'm sorry, Michael, I think you posed another question to Michael there too. It's exciting.
I mean, what's interesting is that there's a very finite list of prohibited uses. And so if you turn it on its head, what are permissible uses? And I think Michael's going to talk about it, but debt, you can't use it for debt service. You can't fund pensions. Things like that are the expressly prohibited, but otherwise there's quite a vast array of permitted uses as long as you fall into the categories we've been mentioning.
Yeah. As far as ineligible uses, the only 4 that are expressly outlined are pension funds, offset reduction in tax revenue caused by providing tax breaks or any sort of changes in law. In addition to that, there's rainy day funds. You can't use them for those, and general infrastructure projects, as we discussed, outside of the reduction in revenue that's otherwise outlined and authorized under ARPA.
Yeah, let's move to our next slide. Unless folks have questions, happy to take questions in the chat. Important deadlines, which I touched on a little bit before, and it's useful to have time, but time then allows you, we are supposed to be, this is the American Rescue Plan. And I sure hope we don't see resources being put to work 2 years from now, because then by then hopefully we've come through our rescue. So I do want, it is nice to have the time, but I hope we can get to, as a country, better clarity as we're doing now on how we can use the resources and put it to work so that it's not 2 years from now. But Michael, let's talk about deadlines and timing.
Yeah, so the biggest deadlines are December 31st, 2024. All costs for coronavirus funds must be incurred by that date, December 31st, 2024. And that means you can still have projects that go beyond that date, but you have to allocate the funds to those expenses. Those projects have to start. As long as those costs have been incurred, that's fine. And the second date is December 31st, 2026, in which all funds must be either expended or returned to the Treasury. So really, as long as your projects are planned for and finished by December 31st, 2026, then that's the sort of key date that you have to remember. In addition to the costs being incurred and the funds being expended by those two dates, there's also the reporting requirements, which I can go over quickly as well. There isn't.
Just as a point of clarification, just as I'm a former accountant, I just wanted to kind of clarify for the 2024 date, do they actually have to be expended or they just have to be obligated? I was thinking there was a distinction there.
Mm-hmm. They have to be obligated.
Okay.
So if you are under contract.
Michael, is it encumbered is the word? I mean, I know we're getting semantics there, but.
Incurred. Well, we're all attorneys, so yes.
Encumbered.
Words are important.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, so the costs have to be incurred. If you're under contract, if construction has started, that all qualifies as being incurred. You can't start a program after December 31st, 2024. That's not under. That's a deal that's not papered, basically.
Yeah, so I kind of look at it. Everything has to be committed by 24 and then spent by the end of 26.
Exactly.
And that's not, I mean, it sounds like a long way away, but as these things go, it'll be faster than, and I was just haranguing about how it's not good to have such a long timeline, but it was not easy to deal with the CARES funding because of the shortness of the timeline. So, it's a double-edged sword on both sides. I think those dates will come up faster than we think. Since the COVID changed the way in which we all deal with time anyway. Let's move to the next slide. So we have amongst us a number of resources we're going to be sharing with those that are participating with us today. Michael and some colleagues from FBT wrote a great piece on you've received ARPA funding, now what, and some best practices. We've touched on some of those components today, but there's even more detail in an article that he wrote. We're happy to send a link to that. Bloomberg has a great piece out. We're going to be sending some resources to those who are participating today. If anyone has any further questions, that was good to get those questions coming out of the chat as to ways in which you can be thinking creatively about uses of funds. And so love to have you all reaching out to us, anybody on the Frost Brown Todd team, at the Right to Win Cities team. My email will be circulated when we circulate the links that we have. And let's move to the next slide. I think that actually my email is next on the next slide. Yeah, we can just go to where my email is. So we'll be in touch through the methods to send out details about, further details about how to use ARPA money. We're all trying to figure out how to use it. So it's going to be a ride for all of us. And so thanks for logging back in. Sorry about the technical difficulties, and we will see you all hopefully in the future, putting good ARPA using ARPA well for our communities, both on the public and private side of the transaction. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.